It is the end of an era. Jerry McDevitt, who has been working as a lawyer for Vince McMahon and WWE dating back 36 years, is winding down his career. He announced this week that he will no longer be representing the company in the ongoing antitrust lawsuit filed against them by MLW. He told WrestleNomics that he is transitioning toward retirement and that lawyers from the firm Paul, Weiss, Rifkin, Wharton, and Garrison will instead defend WWE in the lawsuit. Now, last month, and I've covered this on the show, the judge in the case surprisingly ruled to deny WWE's motion to dismiss the entire case. This was after months earlier that same judge dismissed MLW's complaint, but then gave them 3 weeks to file an amended complaint, which they did. And the judge did a total 180 this time. So now the case goes to discovery and then a possible trial. But if it ever does go to trial, and that's a big if, I think there's a better chance it never sees the inside of a courtroom before some sort of settlement. But what they call the trial setting conference doesn't even take place until June 27th of next year. Then there's a series of deadlines for other motions that extend into June of 2025, which would be the earliest that any trial would begin. McDevitt confirmed to WrestleNomics that he is wrapping things up at the end of this year, and since the case will be litigated well beyond this year, it made sense for him to step aside now. He gave this response via email to WrestleNomics. As you may know, since early 2022, I have been working towards retirement. I had hoped that the court would again dismiss MLW's lawsuit as it did the first time. When it did not, it became obvious that the case would run into at least 2025 in all probability. I advised my client that I would be wrapping things up by year end and that it would make sense for them to secure counsel who can go the distance on the case now that discovery will be starting. There is also the chance that I might be a witness given the allegations. I will be 74 this January, and it just seems like the right time to make the necessary transitions. We have worked with the other firm on other matters, and they are an excellent firm who I will be helping get up to speed. It has been a great 36-year run with a great company and Vince, and I am very proud of all that we accomplished during that time, and I will continue to help them any way I can. After the news broke, the official MLW account tweeted, MLW just won its first retirement match. I would not be gloating just yet. I would not be gloating just yet. You never know how these things are going to work out, but MLW taking a little shot there at Jerry McDevitt. In an interview with the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette in January of last year, McDevitt said that he has been considering retirement for a while. This is what he said at the time. He said, WWE is a major client, but I have other clients. I'll be 72 in January, so I've been trying to turn it down a little bit as I am headed into retirement, but because of my long-standing relationship with WWE, I continue to represent them, although I keep telling Vince I do want to retire. Most relationships nowadays with lawyers and publicly traded companies are at the general counsel level. Outside lawyers work with the general counsel of the company and never with the CEO or the chairman of the board. But my contract, or rather he says my contact, and my relationship is directly with Vince and to Vince. It always has been. It always will be. That's kind of a unique relationship in the landscape of the law these days for the outside counsel to have that sort of direct relationship. So some background here on Jerry. He's kind of the shadowy figure, I feel like. Some background on him. He's been practicing law since 1980. And he got into law after an experience in the service. He was an officer in the Marine Corps. One of his troops stole an air conditioner and was charged with a felony, even though normally stealing an item like that would be, it would constitute a misdemeanor. And the prosecutor only reduced the charge after McDevitt told him that he would hire a lawyer at his own expense if he did not. And it was after that he decided he wanted to represent people in trouble against the government. And he once told Super Lawyers magazine that the most fascinating trial he was ever a part of, because you would think maybe it would be the steroid trial in '94, which made all kinds of headlines at the time. But no, he said the trial that was the most fascinating he's ever been a part of was actually one that had nothing to do at all with pro wrestling. In 1999, he won the only verdict in American history that holds a second party responsible for a suicide. He said there was a young lady who was found dead at a bus stop, shot through the mouth, with a gun that belonged to her fiancé. Her fiancé happened to be a police officer with a history of domestic violence. And they ruled her death a suicide. Her family wasn't so sure, so they hired McDevitt to take the case. And he argued that the cop should be held responsible for her death because he had abused her and contributed to her decision to take her own life, and the jury agreed. And it was a civil trial. This was not a criminal trial. But her fiancé was ordered to pay the family over $200,000 out of that. His relationship with Vince McMahon dates back to 1987 and a case involving Jim the Anvil Neidhart. And this is how he explained it to the Hannibal TV a couple of years ago. He said, back then, Jim the Anvil Neidhart and Bret Hart were the tag team champions, as I would learn, and they were flying into Pittsburgh one night to perform up at the Civic Arena in January of 1987. At the end of the flight, the FBI went on the plane and arrested Jim and charged him with a federal felony of interference with a flight crew, the allegation being that he supposedly punched the flight attendant in a dispute over drinks. At the time, I had been working on a case out in Colorado with a fellow who was then representing Vince and Linda in the early days of WWE by the name of Ted Dinsmore. So when Jim got arrested, Vince and Linda called Ted, Ted called me and asked me if I would be willing to represent the guy. I knew absolutely nothing about WWE at the time. I guess I probably had heard of it, but I really wasn't a fan. I hadn't watched it. Jim shows up the next day, and he's wearing these wraparound shades, has a ZZ Top beard. I'm sure you guys know who he is. He was one of the scariest looking people you'll ever meet in your life, but he turned out to be a hell of a nice guy. What I remember most about it was the day he came in, he was in abject terror that he was going to have to call this guy named Vince. I kept thinking to myself, Christ almighty, what's this Vince guy like if this guy is scared of him? So he did. He had to call Vince and tell him about the trouble he was in, got his butt chewed out, and all the rest of that. In any event, I went on to represent Jim, and he was acquitted of all of those charges. The next day, I brought a malicious prosecution case against U.S. Air and 3 flight attendants who had caused him to be arrested for charges that turned out to be categorically false. He didn't do anything like what they said he did, and I ended up getting him a couple of $100,000 for the troubles over that. I think that kind of got Vince's attention because I don't think he had a great love affair for lawyers at that point. Still doesn't, as a matter of fact. Well, that is something you hear quite a bit, that Vince McMahon does not like lawyers. McDevitt is the one who got Hulk Hogan out of testifying in the Dr. Zahorian steroid trial in '91. When so many other wrestlers, including Roddy Piper, had to testify, Hogan was the only one who did not have to. He got him excused on the basis that Hogan and Zahorian shared a doctor-patient relationship because Hogan had consulted him about wanting to start a family with his wife. And so therefore, compelling him to testify would infringe on his right to privacy, and the judge agreed. Fact is, Hogan didn't want to testify because it would have ruined his image to have to take the stand under oath and tell the truth about his steroid use. It would have exposed him as a fraud for telling all the little Hulkamaniacs out there to eat their vitamins when the vitamins that he was taking were of a very different kind. It would have ruined his image. But fair play to McDevitt for coming up with a very clever way to get him out of that. That's why he gets paid the big bucks. In '94, he was one of the attorneys who got Vince McMahon off on charges of steroid distribution and conspiracy. He never called a single witness during the entire trial. All he did was cross-examine the government's witnesses. And Vince was acquitted. He also represented the company against the giant concussion case that was brought against it by various wrestlers that had worked for the company over the years. And he got the case thrown out. He got a bunch of other ones thrown out as well. There have been other wrestlers. I know Raven was one of them. But there have been wrestlers over the years that have brought cases against the company for the whole, independent contractor designation. They should be employees. They shouldn't be independent contractors. And McDevitt's got pretty much all those cases thrown out as well. So he has probably been, more than any other single person, other than Vince himself, the most consistent MVP for Vince McMahon dating back nearly 40 years. This is the guy who knows where all the bodies are buried, so to speak. Right? The Dark Side of the Ring producers, they were able to get him to sit down for the steroid trial episode that closed out last season, and I thought he was the star of the show. And he doesn't do very many interviews to begin with, especially on camera. But I think it's fair to say that he has been Vince McMahon's most valuable player. And at the end of this year, Vince will not have that weapon at his disposal anymore.